The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Tombstone as Jack Callahan rode into town on a horse that had seen better days. His weathered face, marked by 43 years of hard living, showed no emotion as he surveyed the bustling mining town. The year was 1886, and Tombstone was still reeling from the aftermath of the famous gunfight at the OK Corral 5 years prior. Jack dismounted outside Murphy's general store, his spurs jingling against the wooden boardwalk. Inside, the store owner, a portly man named Henry Murphy, looked up from his ledger with suspicious eyes. "What can I do for you, stranger?" Murphy asked, his voice carrying the wariness that came with living in a town where violence was never far away. "Looking for a place to settle," Jack replied, his voice gravelly from years of trail dust and silence. "Heard there might be some property available." Murphy's expression shifted to one of interest mixed with confusion. "Well, there is one place, but it ain't exactly what most folks would call desirable." "I ain't most folks." The store owner studied Jack's worn clothes and the single Colt .45 hanging low on his hip. "There's a cabin about 3 miles north of town. Been empty for near 2 years now. Owner died under peculiar circumstances. His widow's been trying to sell it ever since." "What's she asking?" Murphy scratched his graying beard. "Last I heard, she'd take $1 for it. Just wants it off her hands." Jack reached into his vest pocket and produced a silver dollar, placing it on the counter with a metallic clink. "Where can I find this widow?" An hour later, Jack stood before Martha Henley, a thin woman in her 50s, whose eyes held the haunted look of someone who'd seen too much. Her small house on the outskirts of town was modest, but well kept. "You sure you want that place, mister?" Martha asked, wringing her hands nervously. "Ain't nobody lived there since my Harold passed. Folks say it's cursed." "I don't believe in curses, ma'am. Just bad luck and worse people." Martha's eyes searched his face. "Harold always said that cabin held secrets. Said he could feel them in the walls. The night he died, he was ranting about voices coming from under the floorboards." Jack handed her the silver dollar. "I'll take my chances." As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Jack rode north toward his new home. The cabin sat alone in a small valley, surrounded by scrub brush and the occasional Joshua tree. It was smaller than he'd expected, just 2 rooms and a small porch that sagged on one side. The interior was sparse, a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a bed frame without a mattress. Dust motes danced in the fading light that filtered through grimy windows. Jack set his saddlebags down and began to survey his new domain. It was then he heard it, a soft sound, almost like breathing, coming from beneath his feet. Jack knelt and examined the floorboards more closely. One section near the fireplace seemed newer than the rest, the wood slightly different in color. He retrieved a knife from his boot and pried at the edges until the board came loose. What he found beneath made his blood run cold. A pair of frightened brown eyes stared up at him from a makeshift hiding space carved into the earth below. A young girl, perhaps 10 years old, cowered in the darkness, her dress torn and dirty, her face streaked with tears and grime. "Please don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jack immediately backed away, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "Easy there, little one. I ain't gonna hurt you. What's your name?" The girl remained frozen, her eyes darting between Jack and the opening above her. "My name's Jack," he continued, his voice gentle. "Jack Callahan. This is my cabin now, but you're welcome to stay until we figure out what's going on. Are you hurt?" Slowly, the girl shook her head. "I'm Emily," she said, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. "Emily Carter." "Emily Carter," Jack repeated. "That's a pretty name. How long have you been down there, Emily?" I don't know. Days, maybe. I lost count." Jack's jaw tightened. "Who put you down there? Who are you hiding from?" Emily's eyes filled with fresh tears. "Bad men. They killed my pa. Said they'd kill me too if I told anyone about the papers." "What papers?" But Emily had retreated back into her shell, curling up in the small space like a wounded animal. Jack spent the next hour coaxing Emily out of her hiding place. When she finally emerged, he could see she was malnourished and exhausted. Her clothes, once probably a nice Sunday dress, were now little more than rags. "When's the last time you ate?" Jack asked. "Yesterday, I think. I had some water from the well outside." Jack nodded toward his saddlebags. "I've got some jerky and hardtack. It ain't much, but it'll fill your belly." As Emily ate ravenously, Jack studied her. She was a pretty child with intelligent eyes, but there was a wariness there that no 10-year-old should possess. Whatever she'd witnessed had aged her beyond her years. "Emily," Jack said carefully, "I need to know what happened to your father, and I need to know about these papers you mentioned." Emily looked up from her food, crumbs clinging to her chin. "Pa found something, a deed, he said, to a mine that was supposed to be played out. But it wasn't played out at all. There was still gold there, lots of it." "Who killed your father?" "I don't know their names, but one of them wore a badge, a sheriff's badge." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. If the local law was involved, this was bigger than just a simple robbery gone wrong. "Where are these papers now?" Emily reached into a small pocket sewn into her dress and pulled out a folded document, yellowed with age and stained with what looked like blood. "Pa told me to hide them, said they were worth more than gold." Jack carefully unfolded the paper. It was indeed a mining deed, dated 1884, for a claim called the Lucky Strike Mine. The name on the deed was Thomas Carter, Emily's father. "Emily, this deed, it's legitimate. Your father owned a gold mine." "I know," she said quietly. "That's why they killed him. They wanted it for themselves." As night fell over the cabin, Jack built a small fire and made Emily a bed from his bedroll. She fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from her ordeal. Jack sat by the fire, studying the deed and thinking about what it meant. Someone in Tombstone, someone with authority, had murdered Thomas Carter for this mine, and now they'd be looking for Emily and the deed. The fact that she'd been hiding in this cabin meant she'd been here when her father was killed, which meant the murder had happened nearby. Jack looked at the sleeping child and felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose. He'd been drifting for so long, moving from town to town with no real destination in mind. But now, he had something to fight for. As he settled down for the night, Jack made a silent promise. He would protect Emily Carter, and he would see that justice was done for her father, even if it meant taking on the entire town of Tombstone. Outside, the desert wind howled through the scrub brush, carrying with it the promise of danger. In the distance, Jack could see the faint glow of Tombstone's lights. Tomorrow he would have to venture back into town for supplies and information, but tonight he would stand guard over a frightened child who had already lost everything. The secret of the dollar cabin was out, and Jack Callahan was about to discover just how far some men would go to keep their crimes buried in the Arizona dust. Dawn broke over the desert with the harsh beauty that only Arizona could provide. Jack had barely slept, keeping one ear open for any sounds that might indicate danger. Emily stirred as the first rays of sunlight filtered through the cabin's dirty windows. "Morning, little one," Jack said softly. "How are you feeling?" Emily sat up slowly, wincing as her muscles protested. "Better, I think. Thank you for the food." Jack had been thinking all night about their next move. "Emily, I need to go into town today. Get some supplies, maybe ask some questions. But I don't want to leave you here alone." Fear flashed across Emily's face. "They might come back. They said they'd search every building until they found me. Then you'll come with me. But we'll need to be careful." "Can you tell me more about the men who killed your father?" Emily's hands trembled as she spoke. "There were 3 of them. The one with the badge was tall, with gray hair and a mustache. The others, one was real big, with scars on his hands. The third one had cold eyes like a snake." Jack nodded grimly. "We'll figure out who they are. But first, let's get you cleaned up and find you some proper clothes." An hour later, they rode into Tombstone together, Emily sitting behind Jack on his horse. He'd fashioned a makeshift disguise for her, his spare hat pulled low over her face, and one of his smaller shirts that hung like a dress on her small frame. Their first stop was Murphy's General Store. Henry Murphy looked up as they entered, his eyes immediately focusing on Emily. "Well, I'll be," Murphy said. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon, Mr. Callahan. And who might this young lady be?" "My niece," Jack lied smoothly. "Just arrived from back east. She'll be staying with me for a while." Murphy's expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced, but he didn't press the issue. "What can I get for you folks?" Jack purchased basic supplies, food, a dress that would fit Emily, and some ammunition for his Colt. As Murphy tallied up the bill, Jack casually asked, "Say, I heard there was some trouble a few days back. Something about a miner getting killed?" Murphy's face darkened. "Thomas Carter. Found him shot dead near his claim. Sheriff Clayton's been investigating but ain't turned up much." "Sheriff Clayton, you say? What's he like?" "Amos Clayton's been sheriff here for about 3 years. Came down from Colorado after the previous sheriff got himself killed in a poker game. He's thorough in his investigations." Jack filed that information away. "Anyone else been asking questions about Carter's death?" Murphy glanced around nervously. "Well, there's been some strangers in town. Rough-looking types. Been asking about Carter's family, whether he had any kin." Emily tensed behind Jack, but he kept his expression neutral. "Strangers, you say?" "Yeah. One of them's been staying at the Grand Hotel. Big fellow with scarred hands. Goes by the name of Dobson. Clay Dobson." Jack's blood ran cold. Emily had mentioned a big man with scarred hands. "What about the others?" "They don't stay in town. Come and go like ghosts. But folks have seen them talking to Sheriff Clayton." After leaving Murphy's store, Jack led Emily to a small boarding house run by a kind woman named Mrs. Patterson. He rented a room for Emily, telling Mrs. Patterson the same story about her being his niece. "You keep that door locked," Jack told Emily as he prepared to leave. "Don't open it for anyone but me. If something happens, there's a back window you can climb out of. Head for the desert and hide until I find you." Emily grabbed his arm. "Where are you going?" "To find out more about Sheriff Clayton and this Dobson fellow. The more we know about our enemies, the better we can protect ourselves." Jack's first stop was the Birdcage Theater, a combination saloon and gambling hall that served as the unofficial information center of Tombstone. The proprietor, a sharp-eyed woman named Sadie Malone, was known for keeping her ears open and her mouth shut for the right price. Sadie was a handsome woman in her 30s, with auburn hair and green eyes that missed nothing. She'd come to Tombstone during the silver boom and had managed to carve out a successful business in a town that chewed up most newcomers. "Well, well," Sadie said as Jack approached the bar. "A new face. What brings you to my establishment, Cowboy?" "Information," Jack said simply, placing a silver dollar on the bar. Sadie's eyes glittered with interest. "What kind of information?" "The kind about Thomas Carter's death, and the kind about Sheriff Clayton's investigation." Sadie's expression grew cautious. "That's dangerous territory, friend. Why do you want to know?" Jack studied her face, trying to gauge whether he could trust her. Something in her eyes suggested she might be an ally. "Let's just say I have a personal interest in seeing justice done." Sadie poured herself a whiskey and leaned against the bar. "Thomas Carter was a good man. Quiet, kept to himself mostly. But about a week before he died, he came in here all excited. Said he'd found something that was going to change his life." "Did he say what?" "No, but he was buying drinks for everyone. Said he was going to be rich enough to send his daughter back east to a fancy school." Jack's heart clenched. Emily would never get that chance now. "What about Sheriff Clayton? What's your opinion of him?" Sadie's expression hardened. "Clayton's not the man he pretends to be. He came to town with a clean reputation, but I've seen him taking money from people who shouldn't be giving it to him." "What kind of people?" "The kind who own mines and don't like competition. The kind who think the law is something you can buy." Before Jack could ask more questions, the saloon doors swung open and a large man entered. He had scarred hands and cold eyes that swept the room like a predator looking for prey. This had to be Clay Dobson. Dobson's gaze settled on Jack, and for a moment, the two men stared at each other. There was something in Dobson's expression that suggested recognition, though Jack was certain they'd never met. "Sadie," Dobson said, his voice like gravel, "I need to ask you some questions." "I'm busy," Sadie replied coolly. Dobson's hand moved to rest on the butt of his gun. It wasn't a request. Jack stepped forward. The lady said she was busy. Dobson turned his full attention to Jack, sizing him up. This ain't your concern, stranger. I'm making it my concern. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other patrons began to edge toward the exits, sensing trouble. Dobson's hand hovered near his weapon, but something in Jack's stance made him hesitate. You're new in town, Dobson said finally. Might want to learn how things work around here before you go sticking your nose where it don't belong. I'm a quick learner, Jack replied. Dobson smiled, but there was no warmth in it. We'll see about that. The big man turned and left the saloon, but not before giving Jack one last measuring look. Jack knew he'd just made an enemy, but he'd also learned something important. Dobson was looking for someone, and that someone was probably Emily. You just made a dangerous enemy, Sadie said quietly. Wouldn't be the first time. What can you tell me about him? Clay Dobson, bounty hunter, gun for hire, all-around bad man. Word is he's working for someone with deep pockets and no conscience. Any idea who? Sadie shook her head. But whoever it is, they want something bad enough to kill for it. Jack left the saloon with more questions than answers. But at least he now had names and faces to go with the threats. As he walked back toward the boarding house, he noticed a man in a sheriff's badge watching him from across the street. Sheriff Amos Clayton was exactly as Emily had described. Tall, gray-haired, with a mustache. But it was his eyes that told Jack everything he needed to know. They were the eyes of a man who'd sold his soul and was comfortable with the transaction. Clayton crossed the street, his hand resting casually on his gun. Afternoon. I'm Sheriff Clayton. Don't believe we've been introduced. Jack Callahan. Mr. Callahan, I understand you've been asking questions about Thomas Carter's death. Just curious about the local news. Clayton's smile was as cold as winter. Curiosity can be dangerous in a town like this. Might want to focus on your own business. I'll keep that in mind, Sheriff. See that you do. And Mr. Callahan, if you're hiding anything or anyone, I'll find out. I always do. As Clayton walked away, Jack felt the weight of the threat. The corrupt sheriff knew something, or at least suspected. Time was running out, and Jack needed to find allies fast. But first, he needed to get back to Emily and make sure she was safe. Because if Clayton and Dobson were working together, the net was closing around them faster than he'd anticipated. The secret of the Lucky Strike mine was worth killing for, and Jack was beginning to understand just how many people were willing to do exactly that. Jack returned to the boarding house to find Emily pacing nervously by the window. Her face was pale, and her hands shook as she pointed toward the street. Jack, I saw him. The big man with the scars. He was asking Mrs. Patterson questions about you, about whether you had any family with you. Jack's jaw tightened. Dobson was moving faster than expected. What did Mrs. Patterson tell him? She said she didn't know anything, but he didn't believe her. He threatened her, Jack. Said bad things would happen if she was lying. Jack moved to the window and peered through the curtain. The street appeared normal, but he could feel eyes watching. We can't stay here. Pack whatever you can carry. We're leaving. Where will we go? Back to the cabin for now. But first, I need to make a stop. 20 minutes later, Jack and Emily slipped out the back of the boarding house and made their way through Tombstone's back alleys. Jack had a destination in mind, the office of Doc Holliday's old friend, a retired lawyer named Samuel Morrison, who still kept an office above the barber shop. Morrison was a thin, scholarly man in his 60s who'd seen Tombstone grow from a mining camp to a full-fledged town. More importantly, he was one of the few people in town who couldn't be bought. Mr. Morrison, Jack said as they climbed the narrow stairs to his office. I need your help. Morrison looked up from his law books, his eyes immediately focusing on Emily. Good Lord, child. You look like you've been through hell. Come in, both of you. Jack quickly explained the situation, showing Morrison the mining deed and telling him about Thomas Carter's murder. Morrison's expression grew increasingly grave as the story unfolded. This deed is legitimate, Morrison confirmed, examining the document carefully. The Lucky Strike mine was thought to be played out, but if Thomas found new veins, he trailed off, the implications clear. Who would have the most to lose if this mine started producing again? Jack asked. Morrison was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words. There's a consortium of mine owners who've been buying up worthless claims around Tombstone. They call themselves the Tombstone Mining Company. If word got out that the Lucky Strike was still viable, it would expose their whole operation. Who runs this consortium? Officially, a man named Harrison Webb, but the real power behind it— Morrison glanced at Emily, then back at Jack. Judge William Clanton. Jack felt the pieces clicking into place. Judge Clanton was one of the most powerful men in Arizona territory, with connections that reached all the way to Washington. If he was behind this, it explained why Sheriff Clayton was involved. There's more, Morrison continued. I've heard rumors that Clanton's been using his position to manipulate mining claims, declaring viable mines abandoned, so his consortium can buy them for pennies on the dollar. Emily spoke up for the first time. My pa said he found papers in the mine. Not just gold, papers that proved someone was cheating miners. Morrison's eyes widened. If Thomas found evidence of Clanton's scheme, he'd have enough to bring down the whole operation, Jack finished. Emily, where are these papers your father found? Hidden in the mine. He showed me the hiding place before they killed him. Jack made a decision that would change everything. We're going to that mine. Tonight. Morrison grabbed Jack's arm. That's suicide. Clanton will have men watching it. Maybe. But it's the only way to get the evidence we need to expose this whole conspiracy. As darkness fell over the desert, Jack and Emily made their way toward the Lucky Strike mine. Jack had left his horse at Morrison's office, and they traveled on foot to avoid detection. The mine was located in a narrow canyon about 5 miles northeast of Tombstone. The entrance to the mine was partially hidden by scrub brush and fallen rocks. Jack could see why it had been written off as played out. From the outside, it looked like dozens of other abandoned claims scattered throughout the territory. Pa said the papers were hidden in a special place, Emily whispered as they approached the mine entrance. Behind a loose rock about 50 feet inside. Jack lit a small lantern and they entered the mine shaft. The air was stale and thick with dust, and their footsteps echoed eerily in the narrow tunnel. Emily led the way, her small hand gripping Jack's tightly. Here, she said, stopping beside what looked like a solid wall. Pa showed me how to move this rock. Together, they pried loose a large stone, revealing a hidden cavity behind it. Inside was a leather satchel containing not just the papers Emily had mentioned, but also samples of gold ore that glittered in the lantern light. Jack examined the documents by lamplight. They were land office records, mining claims, and most damning of all, correspondence between Judge Clanton and various officials discussing the acquisition of supposedly worthless mines. This is it, Jack breathed. This is enough to destroy Clanton and everyone working with him. But their moment of triumph was short-lived. The sound of horses approaching echoed through the canyon, followed by voices Jack recognized. They're in there, Sheriff Clayton's voice carried clearly in the night air. Dobson, take your men around back. I'll cover the front. Jack quickly stuffed the papers and ore samples into the satchel. Emily, is there another way out of here? Pa showed me a passage that leads to the other side of the canyon, but it's narrow and dangerous. More dangerous than staying here. Emily shook her head and led Jack deeper into the mine. Behind them, they could hear men entering the main shaft, their voices growing closer. The passage Emily led him to was barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. Jack had to push the satchel ahead of him as they crawled through the narrow tunnel, Emily's small size giving her an advantage in the tight space. They emerged on the far side of the canyon just as gunshots rang out behind them. Clayton's men had discovered the hiding place and realized their quarry had escaped. They'll be coming around the canyon, Jack said. We need to get back to town and find help. But as they made their way down the canyon, they found their path blocked by a familiar figure. Clay Dobson stepped out from behind a boulder, his gun drawn and pointed directly at Jack. End of the line, Callahan, Dobson said with a cold smile. Hand over the satchel and the girl, and maybe I'll make this quick. Jack pushed Emily behind him, his hand moving to his own weapon. The girl's done nothing wrong. Let her go. Can't do that. She's seen too much, knows too much. Judge Clanton wants this whole mess cleaned up permanent-like. Clanton's finished, Jack said. We have the evidence. The whole territory's going to know what he's been doing. Dobson laughed. You think anyone's going to believe a drifter and a dead miner's brat over a territorial judge? You're more naive than I thought. The standoff stretched taut between them, the desert wind the only sound in the canyon. Jack knew he was fast with a gun, but Dobson already had his weapon drawn. The odds weren't good. It was Emily who broke the stalemate. Mr. Dobson, she said, stepping out from behind Jack. I'll come with you if you let Mr. Callahan go. Emily, no. Jack started to protest, but the girl had already taken several steps toward Dobson. Smart girl, Dobson said, relaxing slightly. Maybe we can work something out after all. But Emily's apparent surrender was a ruse. As she got closer to Dobson, she suddenly threw a handful of sand into his eyes and dove to the side. Jack didn't waste the opportunity. His Colt cleared leather in a smooth motion, and he put 2 bullets center mass into Dobson before the big man could recover. Dobson staggered backward, his gun falling from nerveless fingers. He looked down at the spreading stain on his shirt with something like surprise before collapsing to the canyon floor. We need to move, Jack said, helping Emily to her feet. Clayton and his men will have heard those shots. They ran through the night, the satchel of evidence clutched tightly in Jack's hands. Behind them, they could hear shouts and the sound of pursuit. But Jack knew these desert canyons better than most, and he led Emily through a maze of arroyos and hidden passages that would confuse their pursuers. By dawn, they had made it back to Tombstone, but Jack knew their troubles were far from over. Judge Clanton still had power and influence, and Sheriff Clayton controlled the local law. They needed allies, and they needed them fast, but they also had something their enemies didn't expect, the truth. And in Jack's experience, the truth had a way of coming out, no matter how many people tried to bury it. As they approached the town, Jack made Emily a promise. We're going to see this through to the end. Your father's death is going to mean something. Emily looked up at him with eyes that held more hope than they had in days. Do you really think we can beat them? Jack thought about the evidence in the satchel, about Samuel Morrison's integrity, and about the growing number of people in Tombstone who were tired of corruption and violence. Yes, he said firmly, we can beat them, and we will. The final confrontation was coming, and Jack Callahan was ready for it. The morning sun cast long shadows across Tombstone's main street as Jack and Emily made their way to Samuel Morrison's office. The town was already bustling with activity, but Jack noticed an unusual tension in the air. Word of the previous night's events had spread, and people were choosing sides. Morrison was waiting for them, his face grave. The whole town's talking about gunshots in the canyon last night. Sheriff Clayton's been telling everyone that you murdered Clay Dobson in cold blood. Dobson drew first, Jack said simply. We have the evidence we came for. Morrison examined the contents of the satchel, his expression growing more amazed with each document. This is incredible. These papers prove everything. The fraudulent claims, the bribes, the conspiracy. But Jack, we have a problem. What kind of problem? Judge Clanton arrived in town an hour ago. He's called for an emergency session of the territorial court. He's planning to have you arrested for murder, and Emily declared a ward of the state, meaning she'd disappear into his custody. Jack felt the walls closing in. How long do we have? The hearing's set for noon. That gives us maybe 3 hours. Emily tugged on Jack's sleeve. There's something else. Something I didn't tell you before. Jack knelt down to her level. What is it, Emily? The night they killed Pa, I heard them talking. Judge Clanton wasn't just stealing mines, he was selling information to claim jumpers and road agents. Pa found out about it. Morrison's eyes widened. If that's true, then Clanton's been betraying his oath as a territorial judge. That's a federal crime. But how do we prove it? Jack asked. Emily reached into her dress pocket and pulled out a small notebook. Pa wrote everything down. Names, dates, amounts of money. He gave this to me the night he died. Told me to keep it safe. Jack opened the notebook and scanned the pages. Thomas Carter had been meticulous in his record-keeping. The notebook contained detailed accounts of Judge Clanton's criminal activities, including payments to outlaws and information about gold shipments. "This changes everything," Morrison said. "But we still need to get this information to someone with the authority to act on it." "What about the U.S. Marshal's office?" Jack suggested. "The nearest marshal is in Tucson, 2 days' ride away. We don't have that kind of time." Jack was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he smiled grimly. "Maybe we don't need a marshal. Maybe we just need to make sure the whole town knows the truth." An hour later, Jack stood on the steps of the courthouse, the satchel of evidence at his feet. A crowd had gathered, miners, shopkeepers, saloon girls, and drifters. Word had spread that something big was about to happen. Judge William Clanton emerged from the courthouse, flanked by Sheriff Clayton and several armed deputies. Clanton was an imposing man in his 50s with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to power. "Jack Callahan," Clanton announced in a voice that carried across the street. "You're under arrest for the murder of Clay Dobson." "Before you arrest anyone, Judge," Jack called out, "maybe the people of Tombstone should hear what Thomas Carter discovered before you had him killed." A murmur ran through the crowd. Clanton's face darkened. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Callahan. I hope you have proof." Jack held up the satchel. "I have all the proof anyone could want. Land office records showing how you've been stealing mining claims, correspondence proving you've been taking bribes, and a notebook detailing how you've been selling information to road agents." "Those are forgeries," Clanton said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "Then you won't mind if we let the people decide for themselves." Jack began reading from Thomas Carter's notebook, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. He detailed payment after payment, crime after crime, betrayal after betrayal. The crowd grew restless as they heard how their territorial judge had been selling them out. "This is preposterous!" Clanton shouted. "Sheriff Clayton, arrest this man!" But Clayton hesitated. The crowd was growing angry, and several of the miners were armed. The sheriff might be corrupt, but he wasn't stupid. It was then that Sadie Malone stepped forward from the crowd. "I can verify some of what Mr. Callahan is saying. I've seen Judge Clanton meeting with known outlaws in my establishment. I've seen money change hands." Other voices joined hers. A miner named Pete Sullivan spoke up about losing his claim under suspicious circumstances. A shopkeeper named Maria Santos told of being forced to pay protection money to men who worked for Clanton. The judge's face was red with rage. "Enough of this! Sheriff, I order you to disperse this crowd and arrest these troublemakers." But Sheriff Clayton was looking at the faces around him. Angry faces, determined faces, faces of people who'd had enough of corruption and violence. He slowly shook his head. "I don't think so, Judge. I think maybe it's time for some truth in this town." Clanton's hand moved toward his gun, but Jack was faster. His Colt was in his hand before the judge could clear leather. "I wouldn't," Jack said quietly. "You've caused enough death." It was Emily who delivered the final blow. She stepped forward, no longer the frightened child who'd hidden beneath the cabin floorboards. "Judge Clanton," she said, her young voice carrying clearly, "you killed my father because he found out what you were doing. But he taught me to read and write, and I remember everything he told me, every name, every crime, every lie." The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. "My father was a good man who worked hard and tried to make an honest living. You took that away from him. You took everything away from him. But you didn't take away the truth." Clanton looked around desperately, but he was surrounded by hostile faces. His deputies had melted away, unwilling to stand with him against the entire town. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I have connections in Washington. I'll be back." "No," said a new voice from the edge of the crowd. "You won't." Everyone turned to see a man in a long coat approaching, a silver star pinned to his vest. U.S. Marshal Frank Thompson had arrived in Tombstone. "Marshal Thompson," Morrison said, stepping forward. "How did you—" "Got a telegram yesterday from someone in town saying there was federal business that needed attention. Rode all night to get here." Thompson's eyes fixed on Clanton. "Judge William Clanton, you're under arrest for conspiracy, bribery, and violation of your federal oath of office." As Thompson placed Clanton in shackles, the judge's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand. I was building something here. I was bringing order to this territory. You were stealing from honest people," Emily said simply. "That's not order. That's just greed." The crowd began to disperse, but not before several people approached Jack to shake his hand and thank him. Sadie Malone was among them. "You did good, Cowboy," she said with a smile. "This town's going to be a better place because of what you did." Sheriff Clayton approached Jack hesitantly. "Mr. Callahan, I want you to know, I never wanted things to go as far as they did. When Clanton offered me money, I thought it was just about mining claims. I never thought it would lead to murder." Jack studied the man's face and saw genuine remorse there. "What are you going to do now, Sheriff?" "Turn in my badge. This town deserves better than a corrupt lawman." As the afternoon wore on, Jack and Emily found themselves sitting on the porch of the cabin that had started it all. The satchel of evidence was now in Marshal Thompson's custody, and Judge Clanton was on his way to face federal charges. "What happens now?" Emily asked. Jack had been thinking about that. "Well, you own a gold mine now, a profitable one, from the looks of those ore samples. You'll be able to go to that fancy school your father wanted for you." Emily was quiet for a moment. "What about you? Where will you go?" Jack looked out over the desert landscape, then back at the young girl who'd shown more courage than most grown men. "I was thinking maybe I'd stick around for a while. This territory's going to need honest people to help rebuild after all this corruption, and you're going to need someone to look after your interests until you're old enough to handle them yourself." Emily's face lit up with the first genuine smile Jack had seen from her. "You mean it? You'd stay?" "I mean it. Besides, someone's got to make sure you don't get into any more trouble." Emily laughed, a sound that was like music after all the darkness they'd been through. "I think you're the one who gets into trouble, Mr. Callahan." "Maybe so," Jack admitted, "but it's the right kind of trouble." As the sun set over Tombstone, painting the desert sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jack Callahan felt something he hadn't experienced in years: peace. He'd found his purpose in protecting Emily Carter, and in the process, he'd found something else he'd thought was lost forever. He'd found hope. The secret of the dollar cabin had been revealed, justice had been served, and a lonely cowboy had discovered that sometimes the best treasures aren't found in mines or hidden in the ground. Sometimes they're found in the courage to do what's right, no matter the cost. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, they're found in the trust of a brave young girl who reminds you that there's still good in the world worth fighting for. The story of Jack Callahan and Emily Carter was just beginning, and the future stretched out before them like the endless Arizona sky, full of possibility and promise. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much, and come back often.